Vanessa Timmons is the executive director of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence and has been a writer, activist, and women's health advocate for over 25 years. She attended Marylhurst University's Multidisciplinary Studies program in Portland, Oregon, and has continued her formal education through certificates and training, including the Interpersonal Neurobiology Trauma Certification Program at Portland State University. To learn more about the Oregon Coalition, visit www.ocadsv.org. Okay, hi Vanessa, it's really wonderful to see you.
Hi, Sarah Joy. It's such a great joy to see you, as usual.
Thank you for being able to make the time, the conversation, and all the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you.
Before we get started in some questions that I'm going to dive into relevant to the Bhagavad Gita, I wonder if you could talk about what comprises your work in the world today, like where you've been drawn from, what's relevant about it for our listeners who might be social change agents or average yoga students.
Wonderful. Right now, I'm currently holding the role as executive director at the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and that's a really long title. But what that means is that I work on behalf of survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And we work through their organizations, all of the rape crisis centers, family justice centers, domestic violence shelters, homeless programs in Oregon, and anywhere that domestic and sexual violence survivors intersect with support or systems. And we do quite a bit of public policy work as well, which is working with our state and federal legislators to make sure that the laws and supports are really there for survivors and their families. And that's a very short, kind of quick answer to what we do. But I would say at our core, we are anti-violence advocates, and we define violence as any assault on the body, spirit of a human, of an individual. And so we really primarily see ourselves as social justice advocates, and our field really began with the women's movement and began as a movement, a social change movement, to really challenge gender inequality in all of its forms. So that's a quick response about us.
How have you seen the community and the needs change in terms of like the pace, the volume, the curiosity, the denial? What have you noticed?
Boy, our field has changed. I've actually been in the field for over 30 years. So I have gotten to see the beginnings of my beginnings in the field in the 80s, the early 80s. We were very much at the forefront of pushing against our legal systems, our spiritual institutions, our education systems, and really challenging the idea of women as property. And so we did a lot of reproductive justice work. And I think at that time, this was very much a grassroots survivors helping survivors movement. And over the last 35 years, people have really understood that, women's rights are human rights. And so there's been this great kind of people jumping on board with us, even though we're still rooted in our feminist core. Feminism no longer just means women. Feminism is all people who are interested in gender equality. And so that's one of the wonderful things that's happened over 35 years. I think that this idea of this being a individual issue, a challenge between two individuals, that's really broadened as well. And people really see this as a community issue or as a issue of human beings across the globe. And as a core, one of the core components of this kind of violence, not being like anger or one person not knowing how to handle another person, but really looking at oppression and this idea of one person being valued over another person as the core issue of domestic and sexual violence. And that's a huge shift from the way we addressed it 30 years ago, when we were really thinking of it as between a man and a woman, and that this was about relationships. Maybe it had to do with mental health or alcoholism. We've definitely learned so much more about trauma, social justice, inequality, oppression, and all of the intersectionalities of violence.
So when it first transitioned from looking at it as more of an individual or relational issue to a more cultural or community issue, a social justice issue, did the movement, for lack of a different word, did it face resistance? You're talking about making a culture change, a language change, a perspective change. Did it face resistance?
Oh, tremendous resistance. I think that the resistance came from, I think, this very human place of wanting simple, quick answers that blame and place responsibility on individuals. Like that's a very human instinct. And so the resistance came not just from the systems that we were engaged with, but also from ourselves and our own communities in some ways as we started to broaden this lens. And I think that just from my own perspective, the first level of resistance is your own thinking and really starting to understand that we are all interconnected, that we're all interrelated, and that our approaches have to come from kind of a still place first, and that internal kind of analysis first. And so I think of the resistance shows up in big ways. You know, people saying, you know, it's not really this issue, or it's all her fault. Why did she wear that? Why did he? Let's lock everyone up and, throw away the key, like these kind of quick, easy answers. So the resistance shows up in that way, absolutely. But I think at the end of the day, it also shows up in just our own desire for an answer that others someone else and that doesn't give us the quietness to kind of think about, how do I open myself to this idea that violence is any place that I think of myself as other than someone else. And then it comes from that and moves through that to an act of violence that is tangible, that people can see and touch and then react to.
Yeah, that's a very powerful way that you stated that violence is any act that kind of others the other, that
Yeah.
causes that separateness. And
hmm
the way that you're talking just reminded me to say in yoga, one of the first precepts is called Ahimsa, which means nonviolence. And it's followed by the second precept, which is Satya. It means honesty, or we could call that truthfulness or clarity or clear seeing. And from a place of Ahimsa, we move to Satya. And that is a yogic like stepping stone. You need one stepping stone to get to the next stepping stone.
Exactly. And so that truthfulness is that place where I think the resistance shows up the most. It's that quietness inside of myself to understand truly what violence is in my own body. And then how do I resist that in the world as an advocate
Yeah.
who's trying to create social change? And I don't have like quick answers to that, but I really feel like that's the resistance I'm most interested in understanding right now.
Well, it's very courageous to ask the question of your own quiet place for deep and
Mm.
kind of radical honesty about where your own resistance lives. That takes
Yes,
a lot more fortitude in a human being than just looking to the outside for the perspective of blame or shame.
right, right. I think that radical activism is where our field is really sitting now, because we've matured over time, and now we're starting to realize that um, we have a platform that is important, and we have a voice that is important. And so, how do we really have integrity about how do we use that, and how do we really create social change? Because I mean, I really do believe it's possible. And so, because of that, it has to come from this deeper place.
Yeah.
It's not possible from a place of just policy.
No, no, it's not. I think we're in passionate agreement about that. Yes,
Yeah.
as long as we've known each other, I would say,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's
Absolutely.
also interesting about what you're saying is you're placing clarity and inner stillness and contemplation before clear action. And in the
Yeah.
Bhagavad Gita, our friend Arjuna, who is the main character, who's in his deep despair, he's talking with his teacher, who kind of outlines for him stepping stones, like I was speaking of before, and he gives him 4 paths of yoga, 4 paths through which to experience God or liberation or wisdom or consciousness. And 2 of those side by side paths are the path of action and also the path of renunciation and introspection.
Mm-hmm.
So you're placing them in a relationship with each other, that
Yes.
inner stillness, inner understanding, inner quietude, to proceed clear action or wise action.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that, and because I do see it, as intersectional. I see them as, especially in my role as the executive director, because I'm called on to speak to the legislature, to sit with a survivor, in that most terrifying moment, to work with the advocate who's exhausted and engaged and committed to the work. So, because I am in those places of both action and stillness, compassion and introspection all the time, I see them as like this intersectional relationship where one it's a dance with the other. And I will, if I miss a step in this dance, I will stumble. I stumble often. So, and that's beautiful too, because it reminds me to stay in the dance, to stay in that rhythm, to stay in that relationship.
Yeah, I know that you do a lot of trainings. I also train people on trauma sensitive and neurobiological processes as providers. How do you, when facing a provider, a practitioner, an advocate who's feeling urgent, overwhelmed, like compelled to, maybe I call it jump the net, as if you're jumping the net on the tennis court. How do you help them understand the clarity and like purity of the quiet place inside the action?
Oh, beautiful question. And I do it with demonstration. And it's probably because that's how I learn. And so during my trainings, I literally have moments of stillness and meditation and contemplation and opportunities to move from that into creating possible actions. And what I hear from folks often is, wow, I thought of something I wouldn't have thought of regularly, or I understand myself more deeply because of those moments of stillness. So I've put into my trainings small bits of practice, that allow people to have just the experience of stillness. And if you can imagine what it's like to be a trauma activist or a trauma advocate, we do have to sit in very complex and physically exhausting places. And so we don't get those moments of stillness routinely. It really has to be a practice, something we're practicing on our own. And so those are really profound moments in the training when I turn down the lights and we sit quiet for even 2 or 3, like probably 2 minutes most of the time. And then from there, we have more conversation, and people just have that profound experience of the difference. So I don't try to talk to people about stillness. We experience it together in the trainings, and I find that very helpful.
You just said something else that I want to pull out, because you're referencing that the providers in their work need this quality of stillness, but they need to have like a personal practice or the quality of what I call self-nurturing discipline, just enough to have a daily infusion of the necessities for their own well-being before they're with a client who's in distress.
Absolutely. It's interesting, and I hope this is okay to say, but I've been going through my family troubles or difficulties, and was just in the throes of it, busy. And I talked with you just about something else. I think we were on the phone about something, but there was a quality of your voice that reminded me of being in yoga class and sitting on the mat and having stillness. And just that memory of a practice that I had done 6 weeks ago gave stillness to my body today or yesterday. So the practice is more profound than you even think it is, because it'll show up in ways you don't even know it will show up, with a body movement or a deeper in-breath than you maybe thought you were going to have, or a friend's voice that you practiced with. And then your body remembers that stillness and that practice, and then it shows up. So I just wanted to mention that.
I'm so glad to know that our time on the phone was helpful like that.
It really was. I was like, oh, I remember stillness. I remember hearing Sarah Joy talk and my body being in stillness. It was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know what you're also pointing to there is that we have body memories that are both, I'm not going to call it auspicious and inauspicious. I'm
Yeah.
using kind of a yoga word there. Some of our body memories are nurturing and some of them are agitating. Some body
Yeah.
memories are sattvic, is a
Oh,
word
yes.
from Bhagavad Gita.
Yes.
Sattvic, like we feel lucid, clear, open. We sense the reciprocity, love, and belonging between us. And
Yeah.
some body memories for people that you're working with and people that I work with, their memories are rajasic, they're very agitating. And
Yes.
some body memories prefer not to be known, so they get pushed down into the tamasic undertow. This
Yes.
is a very important thing to really communicate more widely that body memory is real and it's tied into the brain
Yeah.
and then into our thoughts, our beliefs, our self perceptions, and our other perceptions. How do you talk about this with people who aren't in the trainings, who aren't already kind of interested or primed, like the average citizen or yoga student?
Right. Well, one of the tools that we have is to just really talk about I have three questions that I work with folk advocates on. And the first one is, you know, how do you know when you are challenged?
Mm-hmm.
Just how do you know when you are struggling? And that is the first question. And we just brainstorm it. It's not individual. Everyone calls out the things, but we start to generate this list
Mm-hmm.
of how we know. And then it's like, okay, how do you know when you are showing up with your most creative, best self? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know when you're in that? And we brainstorm that. And then the third question is interesting. What environments are present when you can show up as your full self? What
Mm-hmm.
is the environment? What are the qualities of the other people? What's the quality of the space? What's happened before you got there? What happened while you were there? Like, what are the qualities of the environment? And those three questions, really, we get to see pretty clearly that on all three lists,
Mm-hmm.
there's things we did, there's things we heard, there's things we brought to the room. On all three lists, we're seeing that layered intersectional relationship with how we showed up and how we were prepared to show up and what we showed up into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's
It sounds
one
like
way
you
that I get at that.
are you also asking people to kind of gather their senses, their sensory input
Yeah,
from those experiences? Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what did you hear? Thank you for that reminder. What did you hear? What did you taste? What did you feel? And for us as advocates, because we can go from one hospital room to a training room to a child welfare office to a
Mm-hmm.
family's home, all in 10, you know 20, 30, 50 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
some crazy amount of time. And so what we carry from one room to another, and helping advocates understand
Mm-hmm.
that we are carrying something from one room to another, is profoundly important.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things that question helps them to see, is that, wow, where I was before and how I walk into where I'm going next
Yeah.
matters. And that if I can get some stillness between the two,
Mm-hmm.
then I can show up in a better way.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of because this telesummit is also based on the Bhagavad Gita. One of the things I'm saying to my yoga therapists in my trainings and the psychologists and social workers that I work with is Arjuna is in distress. He's the agitated, overwhelmed, confused, despondent character. His teacher represents complete consistency, stillness, clarity. He's not fazed by his students' petulance or perturbance. He's not expecting more from his student, and he's not varying his answers to kind of keep the student liking him. He's
Right.
giving the answers that are from deep truth to his student. He's holding this immense space for Arjuna. And I hear a little bit of that quality of holding the immense space and the intimate, the silent and the loving, the caring and the fortitude for the people with whom you're working.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And also for yourself, and the permission to kind of hold space for the part of you that's heart is breaking,
Yeah.
the part of you that's afraid to go into that next room, that part of you that heard something shattering or triggering.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's also, so it's about that too. Yeah, exactly. And it's also about just how do we take a breath? How do we hold space for that? And then we also have other practices for connecting back to one another and giving space to one another that supports that as well. But
Mm-hmm.
it's this dance um, with vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
willingness. Advocacy is about holding space. At its
Mm-hmm.
really at its core, it's about holding space for um, for the immensity of these very challenging, painful experiences,
Mm-hmm.
so that the survivor can walk not alone, but with someone capable of
Yes.
holding space.
Yeah. I'm here at Kripalu right now teaching, and I'm doing a session on hunger, hope, and healing, which I feel very
Yeah.
passionate about doing. And I was talking with the students about implicit messages, the impressions on our brain and body that we often don't know are there, but they are fueling when we get activated, or some people call it triggered. And a
Hmm.
student was talking with me, and I'm sitting to her right, she's on my left, and based on what she was describing, I asked her just very spontaneously, who was on your team when you were a young person? Who was on your team? And she had that like deer in headlights moment where you're sort of scanning. I said, is there any body memory in you that there was somebody on your team? And she said, no, no, I don't have any sense of anybody being there. Oh, except for once, she said,
Ah,
when I was hospitalized in her late teens or early 20s, she said, when I was hospitalized, they required somebody to sit next to me while I was eating. That
mm,
person was on her team, and she remembered that person as a kind presence.
yes.
And I use the analogy of this person kind of came up alongside you and was with you at this part of your journey. You are remembering her. You've
Yeah.
internalized her as a presence, and that started the journey of like awakening the longing for companionship and care and solace and human kindness for her with other people. Before that,
Right.
she was really lost in her anorexia and her eating disorder. And there's reasons why those disorders, behaviors and
Mhm.
symptoms show up. But that kind of
Right.
coming alongside of when you said it that way, I was just very touched by the the way you're training people to be with
Mhm.
vulnerability and trauma.
And that's what advocates, that's what we do, that we come out of a movement that said, I have been where you've been.
Mm-hmm.
I will walk with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the first advocates were, survivors themselves. They had gone through immense trauma themselves. They'd gone through these experiences of domestic violence or sexual assault, and they had come through it in multiple kinds of ways. But they had this belief that had I walked with another,
Mm-hmm.
my journey would have been easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so we circled back and started
Mm-hmm.
walking with the other.
Yeah.
And so it's the core of our field is to walk with, to
Mm-hmm.
hold space for, to not expertise or um, to bring some sort of thing that the person doesn't have. It's to walk with the absolute total faith that we have in each other what we need to
Mm-hmm.
get to the other side of this event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really it's very powerful, and it's also this is a funny word to say since yoga's both contemporary and ancient and yada yada. But what you're saying is also a very contemporary perspective that
Yeah.
we have in each other, not just you have in you and I have in me, but we have together in each other the resources to navigate this.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're called, advocates, or, because it is that idea of let's be with each other as we walk through this experience. Let's learn, let's explore, let's pull together our resources, let's figure out how to safely navigate this choppy water, this choppy experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if, having read the Bhagavad Gita a ways back, you might remember that there's like little phrases that Arjuna asks a question and his teacher gives him
Yeah.
a response back, and sometimes it's like, a clod of dirt is he who sees a clod of dirt as same as gold is awakened, or something like that. I'm
Right.
just very
Yeah.
loosely quoting. So there's like
Yeah.
statements of he or she who can do this experiences this. And
Yeah.
I was playing around with Jay when we were reading the Gita, and we said, he who exhausts himself provides misery for others, right? Like, or she who
That's a good.
overindulges has to sleep in, right? Like these little like truths, but they're actually, it's true, right? So he
Yeah.
who exhausts himself, she who overindulges, he who runs rampant at the lips, talking, what happens to us? These are
Yeah.
little truths here, and it
Yeah.
might also be fair to say, we who come together rise. That there's a
Absolutely.
truth in that also, that our brains actually come together and experience an increased capacity by our reciprocity.
Absolutely. And I've had the experience of that, being a survivor myself, working with other survivors, working with other advocates. I can say with a lot of confidence that when people come together in vulnerability and openness, that there is this rising, there's this
Mm-hmm.
strengthening and this capacity to change the world. That's
Mm-hmm.
the social justice. That's that
Yeah,
social justice framework.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you a kind of a little bit of a compelling, or maybe I don't know what the word is right now, like a sexy question. It's not about sex, unfortunately, um, but in the perception that the initial reader might have of the Bhagavad Gita, the, they are, in the West here anyway, often affronted that the book is about a war, that it's about a battle, and there's a perception that it's infused with violence, and then yoga teaches ahimsa, so how can these things be compatible?
Mm.
When I talk with my students about the Gita, I see it as Arjuna is coming into a despondent experience in his life, for which the history is in the preface of the book. It makes sense where he is. So he's in this crystalline opportunity where there's friction, mayhem, and despair. And the
Mhm.
battle he has to face across the battlefield is his 100 cousins, which represent
Mhm.
the 100 ways that the human mind gets distorted and goes out of balance. So his battle, when I use the word battle, I mean it like the internal psychological battle, that these forces exist in us that push us
Yes.
out of balance, and these forces exist that compel us to come back to center and to harmony. And his
Right.
battle is actually the dance between those things. But we're
Right.
using the word battle in the Gita, and
Mhm.
since you're an advocate for nonviolence and the eradication of oppression and power, how might we talk about the concept of that psychological battle in a way that's now more culturally competent with the work that you're doing?
That's such a great question. And I don't think, I come up to two things come to mind. And one is that when we're in our suffering and our struggle and we're battling and we're warring inside, it is helpful to know that others have warred before
Mm-hmm.
and that war is natural and that battle is part of it. Because when I disclaim something that I'm experiencing, um, I'm isolated and I'm alone.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a part of me that really learns from like the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or those stories that tell how humans have struggled and fought and warred and done really painful and oppressive things, um, as a way of showing me that those parts of me are there
Mm-hmm.
and that they're not isolated and alone and separate from.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not someone who always has to have um, positive language.
Mm.
I can understand the humanness of battle and war and oppression, and because I've been through those things, they don't have to be far from me. But I do feel like we need to have a new way of languaging so that we can begin to create something really, really radical and really new.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm thinking of in that way, I, one of the ways I talk about that would just to talk about it in really true forms of like the
Mm-hmm.
struggle I have with othering others, or
Mm-hmm.
the struggle I have with blame or
Mm-hmm.
with guilt, or with shame. And I don't want to ever say that I can't struggle with that, because it's going to show up every day. So I try to get as real as I can with my language. And for me, war is a struggle. Um, and something is only a battle when I resist it.
Yeah.
So I try to be open and vulnerable to it. Like, to me, I won't battle the minute I show up and say, this too is true.
Yeah.
This
Yes.
too is true.
Yeah. This
I
too
don't know
is
if that
human. Yeah,
answers.
that's great. This
Yeah.
this too is true. This too is human. This too needs our love and understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, this
Yeah.
too is me. I used to, when I was teaching advocates, we had this exercise, this was many years ago, of the mirror, and we were doing, I think it was anti-racism trainings we were talking about. And instead of talking about all the ways other people um, did racist things or oppressive things, we would say, and this too is true. And we would hold up the mirror, because it was like, I too
Yeah.
have had those thoughts, or I too. And that was a really helpful way of us just kind of dealing with, how do we help people overcome oppression and racist thoughts? We overcome them within ourselves.
Yes. Yeah.
And the
Yes.
mirror is a helpful way of loving oneself in that exercise. So that just came to mind. It was many years ago. I haven't pulled out a
Yeah.
mirror in a while.
Do you know, when people hear that kind of phrasing, that is kind of like the Bhagavad Gita spoken between us here, because
Oh,
when Arjuna hears his teacher saying such things, which are true and lucid and energizing for me to hear, and it pulls me to that possibility that humans can evolve and transform. When Arjuna hears that from his teacher, he's like, wait a minute, you just said this, now you're saying that. You're really confusing me. On the one hand, I'm supposed to get quiet, I'm supposed to take action. Oh, but I'm supposed to hold this mirror up. And actually, it is that, I like to call it, it's that circumferential. There's that
yes.
many resources available for us to awaken. People sometimes say, it's that complex, there's so much to do. And I say, no, no, it's that circumferential, that we have this like circle of resources in each other and in ourselves to draw from.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I when I get that question a lot from advocates, because you can imagine I'm always saying one thing and then another thing. And when I tell them, like, we talk about it in terms of the toolbox and the
Yeah.
toolkit, and the idea, and I say, just trust that the resource you need will rise at the right moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at some points you'll need introspection, at other points you'll need quiet, at other points you'll need right action.
Yeah. Yes.
And and other times you're going to need to pull out your mirror.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You need the, or the other person shows up as your mirror, which is always
Yeah,
fun.
which is always great fun.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I want to honor our time commitment and just ask if there's any one last thing you wanted to say to our listeners. And of course, I'm looking forward to the Brighton Bush Hot Springs time and our live ability to be together. But anything more that you want to say to somebody who's maybe listening with an ear towards this conversation for the first time?
Yeah, I do. I think the last thing that I want to talk about is just that right now, as advocates of social change, there is this weariness across the field, particularly in the work that I'm doing around anti-violence work toward women.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would say is that um, we can be less weary when we come together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just look forward to coming together in so many different ways in the next 4 years with so many different kinds of advocates and social justice folk.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just see you on the weary road.
That's so lovely. Thank you for the invitation for all of us to join you too.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thanks, Sarah
Vanessa.
Joanna.
Love you too.
See you soon.
Bye.